Good morning. Let me welcome you to this lecture this morning, lecture which is part of the Burton C. Einspruch lecture series, which we have biannually. And we have this time here our wonderful visitor from Florida, Professor Berger, who is author of many books and a number of articles, essays. And as a matter of fact, he is the Radak Eminent Scholar at Florida Atlantic University. His chair is the first Holocaust chair in the state of Florida. His books that were on sale yesterday and I think are not around, but I still think available in the bookstore, and I deeply recommend that you buy some of them. He's famous from his research that he has done with the second generation, as well as with the hidden children during the Holocaust. I would very much like to tell you about these books, but in this moment I just can mention their titles, and so please get them if you can. One of them is The Children of Job, available probably here, and the other one is The Witnesses to the Holocaust, the second generation, which he has co-edited with his wife. And then there is one on the appearance of the American Holocaust the appearance of the Holocaust in American literature, A Crisis and Covenant. And then, as I said, there are many articles, please, that you can look up and you can read about his work. He's now coming here and will talk to us about his topic of today, the second generation among the Germans and the Jewish children alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Ashvath. You are a woman of many talents and much great ability. And I'm hesitant to say this, but I think you just have my lecture in that folder that you have put down. So, who knows? Perhaps it would be better without it. But I'm delighted to be here. And what I want to do today is two things: set the stage for you by commenting initially on the two second generations, that is, the daughters and sons of survivors and the daughters and sons of perpetrators. And then I want to share with you some stories that these two generations have shared with us, my wife Naomi and I, who, as Professor Ashvath said, have edited a book called Second Generation Voices, which talks about or presents reflections by children of Holocaust survivors and perpetrators. And then I want to conclude with a reflection, or at least my reflection, on what I think might be some of the lessons and legacies that these two generations might give to the future. Seeking to describe the role of the Jewish second generation in bearing witness to the Holocaust, an Australian friend who himself is the son of survivors and a novelist tells the story of a Yom HaShoah commemoration which occurred in Carlton Cemetery in Melbourne, Australia. And it took place at the city's Martyrs Monument, probably about 55 years ago, when my friend was a youngster, when even I was a youngster. As the rabbi rose to speak, storm clouds gathered, and this kind of heightened the sense of anguish and the memory of despair that filled the area. In the course of the ceremony, the heavens opened and it began pouring. The rabbi, amidst this setting, told the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage. And Moses himself, we are told, carried the bones of Joseph and his brothers, retrieved from the Nile. He carried them for 40 years that the people wandered in the desert. The presence of these bones enabled Moses to persevere, to lead the Jewish people, build an army, and prepare the Israelites to enter the promised land. The rabbi explained that Moses' precious cargo prompted the great leader to exclaim, "Kadima," forward, forward. We must only go forward. Because if the Israelites were ever to turn back, all they would find would be the bones of the dead. While the community must go forward, says the rabbi, it must simultaneously carry the bones of those who perished in the Shoah. The Jewish second generation carries these memory bones of the victims in ways that have important meanings for both the Jewish community and the community at large. What happens when these bones are carried forward in the Jewish second generation? The core question for this second generation remains this: how do they define their relationship to Jewish history, to their parents, to what their parents' suffering means, and what role do they play, do the children play in this suffering? It was their parents who suffered, not the second generation. Where does this second generation fit in? They live a life that's dominated in many ways by the presence of an absence. And that absence is the murdered relatives and family. For example, how many people here have read Art Spiegelman's book, Mouse? It was quite controversial when it first appeared because of the genre itself. It's a comic book form. Spiegelman himself was interviewed and said he believes that in comics as mixing narrative and pictures. The Jews are portrayed as mice, the Nazis as cats. Everybody in the world knows what the relationship is between cats and mice. But Spiegelman did something very clever. When he draws himself with a mouse mask. And at the end of the second volume, it's a 2-volume work, Mouse, there's a panel in which he draws himself at the drawing board, the cartoonist board, and in the background there is an image of a guard at Auschwitz, and the guard is holding a rifle, and the rifle is pointed right at Spiegelman. A graphic way to emphasize the continuing impact of the Holocaust on the second generation. We're going to get to that more shortly. What is the legacy of the Holocaust for the second generation? That's the question. Well, there are certain issues that emerge. One, of course, is the issue of intergenerational communication. Difficult enough under circumstances where you live in a non-traumatic environment. If any of you are parents, you'll know what I mean. And if any of you are children, you know how totally incompetent your parents were until you became about 21. Now, what are some of the other issues? Well, parental enmeshment What does that mean? It means that for many survivor parents, at a time when most people were learning parenting skills, they were in Auschwitz. They were on the run. They were in hiding. They were in labor camps, ill-prepared to become parents. I mean, whoever is prepared to become a parent. Flawed parenting skills. It doesn't mean they don't love their children. It means that for many of them, they're afraid to embrace the children because they don't want to lose children again. Their children have already been murdered during the Holocaust. Now, what else? Issues of separation. I can't leave my parents. My parents need me. But I must leave my parents because I've got to live my own life. Frequently, mothers, survivor mothers, when their daughters come home from dates, they live vicariously through the daughter's experience because they weren't dating. They were trying to survive at that age. What else can we say about children of survivors? All of these psychological issues, on the one hand, but very positive effects of being in a survivor family too. Very close bonds, very close loyalty, affiliation. A questionnaire was given maybe 20 years ago to children of survivors and children of non-witnesses, that is, American-born parents. And this questionnaire consisted of maybe 50 items. One of the questions was, do you feel responsible for the welfare of your parents? Generally speaking, the response on the part of the non-witnesses, children of non-witnesses, was something like, are you crazy? The response on the part of the children of survivors was absolutely. The other thing about the second generation is frequently they become the parents of their parents. The survivors, many of them came here, didn't know the language, were terrified of police, terrified. When, in fact, we drive down the street, you and I, and we see a flashing red light in the rearview mirror, we know what we think. I don't have to repeat it here, nor would I in polite company. But survivors don't think of, oh, damn, another ticket. There's some other associations there. Being arrested, being tortured, being sent away. Forms come in the mail, ordinary forms, junk mail. Terror. There's a form because the Nazi bureaucracy. The children become the parents of their parents. Now, there is, however, an other second generation about whom much less is known. And this is the generation of the offspring of German perpetrators. Professor Ernestine Schlant, who you might well better know as Ernestine Schlant Bradley, the wife of former Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey, correctly asserts that the Holocaust is as much a permanent part of German history as it is of Jewish history. That's true. However, there's a significant difference. The German second generation needs to confront a repressed past in which the fate of the Jews is never acknowledged. At least not acknowledged by their parents, which is the perpetrator generation. Moreover, the German generation after may seek to avoid that knowledge or to suppress it or to choose consciously not to confront their legacy. For example, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler is a Nazi. I don't know, do we call her a neo-Nazi? But anyway, she's not exactly sympathetic to the cause of working through what her people have done. Although both second generations, the Jewish second generation and the German second generation, have been raised in either total or near total silence about the past, the reason for that silence is very different. Survivors didn't want to hurt their children by talking about their terrible experience. The children didn't want to cause more pain for their parents. The perpetrators were silent because of their guilt. They never developed what the Mitscherliches call the ability to mourn. They never acknowledged what they had done. And we see, well, I'll get to that in a moment. Both groups, I suggest, share the need to find out who they are, which in turn necessitates them working through, in a healthy way, their relationship with their parents. It sounds strange to talk about the Holocaust and then parental relationships, but that is the core of the issue. Many in the second generation seek a tikkun atzmi, a healing of the self. Tikkun atzmi. Many also seek, insofar as possible, to achieve a tikkun olam, a mending or healing of the world after this great rupture that we call the Holocaust. Sons and daughters of survivors are, in fact, like the children of Job of antiquity. They are, so to speak, replacement children. But unlike the book of Job, where we have a Hollywood ending, the riches are replaced, the family is restored, the Dallas Cowboy season tickets are given back, it doesn't work that way for the children, the contemporary children of Job, because they live in homes marked by trauma. Let me again refer to Art Spiegelman. He had a brother named Rishu who was murdered during the Holocaust. His parents have an enlarged photograph of Rishu in their bedroom. And Spiegelman tells his fiancée that it's terrible to have sibling rivalry with a ghost. How many of you students have brothers and sisters? Okay, well, you know what sibling relationships can be at a certain moment in your life. Can you imagine having those tensions and those disagreements and those rivalries with a ghost? A difficult situation. What are some of the questions that confront the children of survivors? Well, it depends at what age we're talking about. Different questions at different ages. As children, they wonder why their friends have grandparents and they don't. Why are we different? Why don't we have any extended family? We have photographs, maybe, but no flesh and blood people. Later, they wonder what happened to their parents' first families. Theologically, there are questions. The Zawitzer Rav, sitting in Auschwitz, said to a group of his followers, "It's possible that God is a liar." And his followers were astounded. They said, "What do you mean?" And he said, if God were to look down on Auschwitz, open his window and look down on Auschwitz, he would say, "I did not do this," and that would be a lie. There is a man in Italy Daniel Vogelman is his name, and he contributed to our book, a son of survivors, and he puts the theological question like this: is it even possible to believe in God after Auschwitz? And if it's not, how can one continue as a Jew without such a belief? So these are issues that are fundamental to many in the second generation. It's true that these are theological issues, but the secularists also have their share of questions. Their share of questions concerns the notion of justice. Is there justice in the world? What can we do to try to achieve it? I said earlier that many in the Jewish second generation seek to achieve a tikkun olam, a healing or repair of the world. And they do that remarkably, given their backgrounds, given the homes they were raised in, by entering the helping professions. Many are mental health professionals, marriage and family therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, writers, attorneys, and teachers. The second generation collectively speaks with a moral voice, especially concerning issues such as the ongoing problem of genocide in the world. Many of the second generation members were involved in counseling the children of Vietnamese boat people when that phenomenon was so much in the news. This generation, the second Jewish generation, emerged as a distinct social force in the 70s. They began writing in the late 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, writing books, novels, poetry, making films. The second generation, Jewish generation, is connected intimately to the Holocaust by both a physical and a psychic umbilical cord. And I want to quote Helen Epstein. Some of you may know Helen's work. Children of the Holocaust was a book that she did in 1979 that really validated the existence of a worldwide phenomenon, children of Holocaust survivors. She says this: remembering the Holocaust is not an issue for us. We are, in our own parents' minds, the answer to the Holocaust. We are, in our own minds, the guardians of a problematic, unique, and volatile legacy. We do not need to be reminded of it. Rather, we need to learn how to translate our consciousness of evil, our skepticism, our sense of outrage into constructive action. Now, what about the children of perpetrators? We really need to focus on them and see what's going on with them. One thing that we need to understand is that offspring of the perpetrators, for their part, need to confront the enormous conflict between the love they have for their parents on one hand and the fact that their parents were Nazis. Think about it. Well, I love my father, and he's this middle-class, middle-aged man, slightly overweight, comes home from work, a little tired, eats supper, we play games, he reads me a story. I really love this guy. And then one day, I come home from high school, and I see the police are here. And they're here to arrest my father because he was a high-ranking Nazi official. The teenager didn't know the father when the father was walking around with his Luger revolver and his black shiny boots murdering people. He was this schlepper, you know, the middle-aged guy who, a little bit tired, worried about the economy, maybe watching the soccer match. So there's this conflict. their parents may have been Nazis. They could have been Nazi sympathizers. They could have been informers for the Third Reich. Or they could have been passive witnesses who watched as their neighbors and their friends were humiliated, robbed, and deported. Many of the German parents and grandparents were themselves murderers. What Telford Taylor, one of the judges at Nuremberg, described as the running dogs of murder. Not the Nazi elite, just those who did the dirty work. Some were prominent industrialists, such as Alfred Krupp. Others were cultural icons of National Socialism, such as the infamous Richard Wagner, the great composer. The German second generation inherits the sins of the fathers and mothers through no fault of their own, much in the manner described in the book of Jeremiah. The fathers have eaten a sour grape, and the children's teeth are set on edge. The struggle to reconcile their image of German identity with the murderous anti-Semitic history of the Third Reich occurs amidst a background of familial silence about what happened. I want to read to you a statement by a man named Martin Rumscheit, who is a pastor and a son of perpetrators. And he specifically focuses on this issue of silence on the part of the perpetrator generation. He says this: 6 million Jews dead, gone. I never knew you, but how present you are to me in the silence that marks my generation. Indeed, it is the protest against that silence which makes us a generation, especially to ourselves. This phenomenon among the perpetrator generation, the phenomenon of silence, is described by Alexander and Marguerite Mitscherlich, as I indicated earlier, as the inability to mourn. The Mitscherliches then say this. They describe many in the German second generation as orphans with parents. I've always been struck by that phrase, orphans with parents. In other words, there were biological parents there, but they weren't parenting. They were lying. They were lying to themselves, and they were lying to their sons and daughters. And I think here it's very important to keep in mind the rest of that quotation from Jeremiah. But everyone shall die for his own iniquity. Every man that eateth the sour grape, his teeth shall be set on edge. But the German second generation are not murderers. They're not, the children of the perpetrators are not guilty of the crimes. But as Elie Wiesel has pointed out, I think correctly, they're responsible. They're responsible for perpetuating the memory of what their parents have done. There is a film that I would strongly recommend to you all called Dark Lullabies. Dark Lullabies. It was made by a Canadian woman, Irene Lilienhelm Angelico, German-born daughter of survivors. And in this film, Dark Lullabies, she has a discussion with a man named Harold Ludars, L-U-D-E-R-S, who is her counterpart. He's also a second generation, only he's the second generation of German perpetrators. Here is what Harold Ludars says, which I think beautifully sums up the difference between the two generations. For all children of survivors, he says, you can go into the past and it will make you closer to your people. But I think in a way for some Germans it is effectively the other way around. The more you kind of go into it, the more it takes you away from it, at least from a big part of your own people, from a huge part of the history of your own country. I envy you that you could do that, feel close to your people. Jews, the second generation of Jews, actively pursue the past in order to get closer to their legacy, to their inheritance, to their identity, to try to find their place in Jewish history. Germans have to reject that past because it's a murderous past. So that, for example, many in the German second generation send themselves into exile. They have to get away from their country. They prefer not to speak German. For example, everyone has heard of Mr. Wagner, the composer. Well, he has a grandson, Gottfried Wagner, who lives in Italy, who's persona non grata in Germany because he's sullied the Wagner name. Gottfried Wagner spoke to us at Florida Atlantic University several years ago. Very charming and engaging man. And he says that he remembers when he was a young boy that his parents would show pictures of Mr. Hitler. And next to it was USA, Unser selig Adolf, our dear or beloved Adolf. But visitors after the war from America, oh, it's USA, that's wonderful. You know? So there's a difference. Now, for the German second generation to confront this repressed past, it's necessary, in the words of the granddaughter of the vice commandant of Auschwitz, to live in complete opposition to what the generation before me did. You have to cut off in order to fulfill. For the Jews, you have to get closer in order to fulfill. Julie Goshawk, herself a therapist who lives in the Boston area, German-born daughter of survivors, succinctly describes the different emotions that each generation has when they try to deal with their parents. Children of survivors, she writes, can, for the most part, look to our parents with pride and admiration. The children of perpetrators, however, see themselves reflected in the eyes of evil. Major, major difference. Now, what else? Did anybody here ever read the name Julie Salomon or hear the name Julie Salomon? Did anybody here ever read the Wall Street Journal? What a relief. I thought only people in Boca did that. Up until very recently, Julie Salomon was the film critic for the Wall Street Journal, and she still writes feature items for them in culture, issues of culture. And she also writes for the New York Times. In any case, Julie Salomon, whose mother was from Hungary and a survivor, wrote a memoir called The Net of Dreams. And Julie knows Steven Spielberg. When Spielberg was making Schindler's List, Julie and her mother were going back to Europe, to Hungary obviously, but also to Poland. And so she asked Spielberg if she and her mother could visit the set of Schindler's List. And he said yes, and Spielberg's publicist and Julie were exchanging faxes about how to arrive, where it was, blah, blah, blah. And one of the faxes, Julie reports, was a cheery message from the publicist saying, "Oh, don't worry, Auschwitz is very easy to get to." What was Julie's response? It's getting away from it that's really very difficult. Not getting to it, getting away from it. The Jewish second generation doesn't get away from Auschwitz. That's impossible. Rather, how Auschwitz continues to wound and how the second generation witnesses work through it is the leitmotif of the Jewish second generation. Now, what does it mean to work through something? What does that mean? Well, it does not mean getting over the Holocaust. Rather, working through, I think, should be understood in a therapeutic sense of that phrase. What does it mean to work through? Well, it means that one revisits the source of pain by speaking about it, analyzing its impact on an individual's perception of his or her psychosocial life, his or her religious perspective, and his or her view of the other. In the process, one seeks to detoxify issues so that further exploration and understanding can occur without the various psychic barriers that can block self-understanding. That's a mouthful, but basically what I think it means is that a repressed past returns with a vengeance, that it's necessary to confront what the issues are in order to deal effectively with them. So I think we have to ask, what does the Jewish second generation do with their inheritance? They've confronted it, they've worked through it, they've detoxified it to the extent that they're able to talk about it. What do? Emmanuel Levinas, who was a great philosopher, says, it is not memory itself, but the reading, the interpretation of the facts of memory that is crucial. The work of memory, he says, consists not at all of plunging into the past, but of renewing the past through new experiences, new circumstances, new wonders or horrors of real life. And from this point of view, it is the future that is important and not purely the past. The essential is always to find the actuality of the lessons of the Holocaust. So what is Levinas saying? His call is for each generation to interpret and renew the facts of memory. Well, don't Jewish people do that at Pesach, at the Seder? Aren't we called upon to feel as if it's we ourselves who are emerging from bondage? If you don't have this personal experience, then you haven't successfully carried out the ritual. You may have indeed enjoyed a marvelous meal, but you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Like much of the modern and postmodern world, Levinas's call invests individuals with the task of the responsibility for reading, that is, interpreting and shaping the experience. It's this shaping of experience that defines the second generation. Because after all, the second generation's experience is not that of seeing bodies stacked like cordwoods, of seeing flames from crematoria, of seeing husbands and wives, children, and other relatives shot before one's eyes. That's not their experience. Their experience is something different. Their experience is surviving the survivors. Surviving the survivors, to put it starkly. They are growing up in homes where the memories are different. Again, referring to Spiegelman's book. How does that open? Well, when Art is a youngster, maybe 8 years old, he's roller skating with some friends. He falls down, skins his knee, his friends skate away. So he skates home and, sniffling and crying, and his father said, Vladik, his father says, "What's wrong?" And he says, "Well, I was skating with my friends and I fell down and they ran away." Now, there are many things you can say to an 8-year-old as a parent when that young boy or young girl comes to you and tells that story. What does Vladik say? "Friends," he sneers. "Ha, friends. Lock them in a room for a week without food and you'll see who your friends are." That's not exactly what you would expect to hear as a child. Now, what about the German second generation? And then I'll end my theoretical part and tell some tales. Dan Baran wrote a book called The Legacy of Silence. The Legacy of Silence, Encounters with Children of the Third Reich. He interviewed many, many children, perpetrators, for this study. 2 dominant images emerge from his interviews. One, he calls the dark side of the mind, and the quest for hope. The first image, the dark side of the mind, is clinically called denial and repression. The quest for hope, says Baran, is the German second generation's attempt to work through the process of parental euphemisms and distortions and outright lies about their role during the Holocaust, and to acknowledge exactly what the parents did and what the country has done. Now, there's another major difference. Children of survivors are charged, if not formally, at least perhaps genetically, with the task of biological survival and having other children, the third generation. Children of victimizers, many of them, appeared fearful that they would perpetuate a bad seed. They tended not to have children or to wait much longer to have children. Now, what are some of the themes that we've summarized, or I can summarize for you? A connection with the past on the part of the Jewish second generation, a rejection of a very painful and murderous past on the part of the German second generation. The Germans, many of them feel the need to find out their own identity before they confront what their parents have done. Let me say just one more preliminary word. Believe it or not, they say that theologians go on for an eternity, but I will try not to do that. Like ripples in a river that caused by a rock thrown into that body of water, the 6 million-fold shock waves caused by the Shoah continue to emanate throughout the generations. I want to say a couple of words. 3 examples from the Jewish side, 3 examples from the German side, and then a conclusion. Diane Wishegrod writes in the terms of mother-daughter relationships. Her mother comes, or she goes to visit her mother who lives in Jerusalem. Her mother's a survivor. She visits her every year. And her mother tells a story called The Coat. Her mother was hidden. Her mother and father were hidden by a non-Jewish couple. The non-Jewish wife says to Diane's mother that when she was a little girl, she wanted very much to buy a coat, a very fancy fur coat that was in the window of a shop, but she couldn't afford it. So she worked very hard. Her parents gave her an allowance. She saved her money, and she went to this store as a little girl after a year, and she said, "I want to buy the coat that was in the window." But the shopkeeper said, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't. I already sold it." And the little girl was crushed. And she goes outside, and she sees another little girl wearing that coat. That other little girl's parents had bought it for her. That other little girl was Diane's mother. And here they were in hiding, and the mother never knew, why is she telling me this story? Is she going to turn us in? Is she still harboring that? So the coat talks about these issues in terms of a rescuer and the uncertainty of what was going to be the fate of her mother living with or being helped by a woman who still remembered her pain at losing this coat. Another story, this one contributed by a colleague of mine who teaches at Florida International University in Miami. After the war, he was born after the war, as an infant, his mother was nursing him, and her breasts were dried up. She couldn't feed him anymore. She didn't know what to do. She was walking through the town looking for women who would help her suckle her infant, and some did, some didn't, and she was desperate. And there was a woman that she found who was a collaborator with the Nazis during the war. And Asher's mother asked the woman to help. The woman refused. But at that moment, Asher's mother saw a Russian soldier in the corner. She made eye contact with the woman who refused and indicated that she knew the Russian soldier was there. The woman who refused was afraid that she herself would be turned in and didn't want to be left to the tender mercies of the Russian soldier, so indeed agreed to feed Asher as an infant. These are the stories one hears as an infant. What else to say? Well, the story of my wife, who initially rejected her Holocaust inheritance, as did most of the Israelis in the early 50s and 60s, until she took a trip to her hometown in the Slovak Republic, where the Holocaust, incidentally, is a taboo subject. Taboo, not mentioned. And we went to the Jewish cemetery there, and reconnecting with her past, she felt a sense of liberation. She was finally able to accept what had happened. Briefly, some stories about the second generation in Germany. Has anyone seen the movie Nasty Girl or heard of it? It's based on a woman, Anna Rasmus. Anna wrote a high school, won a prize on history writing in high school. It was some obscure topic. She decided that she wanted to understand what her native town of Passau had done during the war. She had heard or was grown up just hearing stories about Passau's great heroic resistance to Nazism. Well, it turned out that the town was fully collaborationist, and access to records were blocked. She was called a Jew whore. She was threatened. Her marriage broke up because her husband's family were Nazis. Eventually, she left Germany, now lives on the east coast of the United States, and is instrumental in bringing groups of German Jews back to Germany. Have you heard of Adolf Eichmann? Yes, indeed. Well, one of his sons, Richard Eichmann, is an archaeology professor, interestingly enough. And his mother never spoke of the past, he reports. I wonder why. I often asked, but it was like a black hole. My mother's silence only strengthened my belief that we had something to hide. Taboo breeds distance. And the last story I want to share at this point, a woman named Liesel Appel, who was born as a gift to Hitler. She was a wished-for child. It was a great honor to have children for the Fuhrer. Her father was a Nazi Party official. And one day after the war, when she was 9 years old, she had been raised in a home that encouraged kindness to the stranger. Her father, she reports, frequently brought in people who were down on their luck, and they would give them meals, etc. So after the war, when Lisa was 9 years old, this man came to the door and told her the story that during Kristallnacht, as a boy, when the hordes were breaking the synagogue windows and breaking the shop windows and beating Jews, he had been thrown off a balcony of a home near Liesel's home. And his life was saved because he was caught by a man, a German man, who then placed him down. After that experience, Willie Meyer's family went to Israel. Now he's come back to thank the man. Liesel thinks that man was her father because her family always said, be kind to strangers, help others, etc. So she brings the man into her house. Her mother then orders the maid to take Liesel upstairs and lock her in her room. She comes down after the man leaves, and her mother says, don't ever bring someone like that in this house again. And she says, someone like what? And the mother said, he's a Jew. We don't want his kind here. Well, a long story short, it turns out that Liesel's father was a mid-level Nazi official who, in fact, spent time in prison. She never forgave her mother for that and entered into a long period of rebellion, married an African American, went to Africa, lived there for many years, never spoke to her mother after that. She also wound up converting to Judaism, and for a period of time ran a health food store in Boca Raton, Florida. She's recently published her memoirs, and I can't wait to see them. And I said 3 things, but I lied. I want to say one more story. There's a woman named Elke, a pseudonym, who was a graduate student, and she went to for therapy because she was having a difficult time reflecting on her parents, on her childhood. And she said, for example, well, my father is an excellent swimmer. And I remember they took us swimming one day, my brother and I was swimming, and I got in trouble. And I was really in trouble. And my father didn't do anything. He just stood there. Finally, at the last moment, my brother came out and rescued me. Not only that, but my father speaks with pride about the great mitzvah, the great honor it was to introduce Adolf Hitler. That father introduced Hitler. And she says, you know, sometimes my father acts like a Nazi. And the analyst, older than she, said, my dear, your father was a Nazi. And the father told this story about a girl who was sexually abused and then murdered. Turns out that the father was the criminal. So the daughter's initial reaction was to reject the father, to move out of the house. Finally, however, she accepts the father because the bonds of loyalty to the parents were stronger than the revulsion at their deeds. So everything is not all sweetness and light. Now a conclusion, and thank you for your patience. Humanity is still challenged by the need to learn tolerance and sensitivity to the other. The psychosocial and theological legacy of the Holocaust are palpable presences in the lives of the second generation. Members of these 2 generations who have confronted that legacy know what it means to walk through the biblical valley of the shadow of death. Like their counterparts of antiquity, they fear no evil, but they are immensely conscious of this evil, having been raised in its hovering presence. Moreover, this evil assumes many guises, both ancient and modern: anti-Semitism, homophobia, racism, prejudice, ethnic cleansing, genocide, Islamic fanaticism, suicide bombers. The rod and the staff that this second generation employ in seeking a way through this valley of death and evil include memory, compassion, empathy, and a commitment to social justice, as well as the possibility of meaningful dialogue. In a book called Generations of the Holocaust, a German second generation member working on a kibbutz, and many Germans do go to Israel as a kind of penance, work on a kibbutz, some study at Hebrew University, learn Hebrew better than many native-born Jews do. This one second generation Sabra, born in Israel, works on the kibbutz, and he goes to the German second generation and says this: your father gave my father gas. I'm giving you these grapes. And that was a start. Now, as these 2 generations seek to confront and shape memory, there will be many difficulties along the way. Authentic dialogue between the descendants of victims and the offspring of perpetrators is crucial. Where are we? What will be the outcome of this? And where do we all belong? Elie Wiesel retells a Hasidic tale in the foreword to The Gates of the Forest that I think illuminates the position of the second generation and its possible salvific effects or salvific role in bearing witness. And here's the tale. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, Maggid is a teacher, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, Master of the universe, listen, I do not know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer. And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Later still, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasau, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, I don't know how to light the fire, I don't know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient. It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. Then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Rishon to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. I am unable to light the fire. I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place. However, all I can do is tell the story, and this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient. Thank you.
I know that some of you asked to go to class as a matter of fact. It's already late from class. But maybe do we have Debbie? Can we stay another 5 or 10 minutes? For those who have to go, please leave, because we are a little bit over time. But
You can stay all day for the bagels.
So perhaps please ask, perhaps we have another 10 minutes to ask questions.
And if you are late to class, just blame it on me. Yes?
I just returned from a very incredible trip called In the Footsteps of European Jews. And I went with my 84-year-old mother and my 2 sisters. And we took a side trip to my mother's hometown of Poland, which she thought she'd never found on the map, so she always thought it was wiped out by the Nazis. And we were in Budapest, Prague, Krakow, and Warsaw, and she was in a town east of Berlin. And I just want to say that to listen to you, because we just returned, was really very incredible, because when you spoke of Auschwitz, I saw it. And when you spoke of the different stories and the different kinds of realities of today, of going to a Jewish cemetery, which was always the first place we tended to go, I personally thank you, and to be able to feel it in your heart and your soul in a whole different dimension is really quite profound. As somebody who is not a child of survivors, but part of the Holocaust experience, how do you suggest that we continue to teach and help our children, generations that go beyond the children of survivors, to understand and appreciate this important part of our history and our life?
Well, thank you very much for your comments and for your question. I think that's really the major issue. It's almost impossible to do, therefore we must do it. We have some obstacles to overcome. Generally, as a culture, we have stopped reading. We are what is euphemistically called visual learners. That is, we go to movies. And since it's on the screen, it's got to be true, right? So that's something we really need to overcome. However, you know, there's a project that started, and I really will get to your question, but there's a project that was started at Haverford College. I know about it. It was in the New York Times maybe within the last 10 days, and I know about it because I was contacted by one of the students there. They are mobilizing people to write letters to editors, to collect money, to sensitize people to the tragedy that's happening in Darfur. And this has become a national enterprise. So that's one thing to do. It is true that one person's actions can save a life. And it's also true that, and perhaps this is why the Talmud says that he who saves one soul saves the world entire. Now, what do we do about the youngsters, which is your good question? Do you know the Paperclip project in Tennessee? What a great model. The worst thing we can do is to try to teach non-age appropriate material. For a 7-year-old, you don't talk about selections and gas chambers, but you do talk about prejudice. And there are many experiments about this. You know, there's a famous one years ago, where a teacher, I think in the 4th grade was it, who said, well, everybody with brown eyes will be discriminated against today. Everybody with blue eyes tomorrow. And, you know, kids begin to feel, well, that's not right. I didn't do anything. And, you know, they begin to be sensitized. All the tall people discriminated against. All the short people. All the girls. All the boys. Everybody with sweaters. Everybody with jackets. You begin to get the kids involved in this. Very important. Look at what happened with this terrible devastation with Hurricane Katrina, for example. There were kids collecting pennies. I mean, we really have to tap into this wonderful, naive enthusiasm while there's still time to do it. Because there are lots of other distractions, lots of other snares that are out there in the culture. And I can't answer your question very well, but except to say what I did say, and also to say that there's no alternative to educating them. We have to spend time with them, we have to read, we have to be open to their questions, we have to be able to say prejudice is wrong, and we have to say if you hear anything that you're uncomfortable with, you should say, I'm uncomfortable with it. And the best way to do that, as all of us who are parents know, is not only to say it, but more importantly is to model it. Very big disconnect between what we say and what we do, and that in itself is confusing.
I received some information from the Kinder Transport Association in New York, and information on what they were doing toward world healing. But I didn't see any indication of children of the survivors, second-generation children.
Meet in Boston, they meet in Jerusalem, and they meet in Berlin. Other groups are fostered by several of the Jewish agencies, for example, the American Jewish Committee and the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League, bringing groups together. In Israel, there are several organizations that are devoted to this, and especially, excuse me, Professor Bar-On, Dan Bar-On, has formed a group that is in constant dialogue with their German counterparts. Is it enough? Probably not, but it's a beginning, and we're living in an age of dialogue. You know, the dialogue between the generations, dialogue between Jews and Christians, dialogue among Christians of different denominations. I think it's a hopeful sign, especially when you consider the alternative. You know, speaking is always better than fighting.
I think one last I was wondering, in your research, did you find that it like skipped a generation? Like, I myself didn't want to hear about it, but my daughter is extremely interested in it and got my father to talk about it. And did you find that?
Well, yeah, we found a couple of things. Usually one child in a survivor family is a designated bearer of the information. The others may be indifferent, they may deny, they may suppress or reject. For example, there's a film, a very good second generation film called A Generation Apart, made by Jack and Danny Fisher. The younger brother is the designated bearer of the legacy. He says the Holocaust is the most important thing in my life, although obviously both of them were born after the event. His older brother said, "You're crazy. The Holocaust has no impact on our lives, and it certainly doesn't impact me," which of course it does by just that statement. Does it skip a generation? That's unclear to me. What is clear is that, generally speaking, grandparents may be much more open with grandchildren than they were with their own children. I think that's true. I think that's true.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.